So it's a little bit of a shift. And I say that not pejoratively to the way that things have been done, because I when that model, that sort of 3-event episodic appointment-based testing model was initiated, the field of strength and conditioning and exercise science was really sort of being birthed at around the same time, this late 70s, early 80s timeframe. Boyd Epley at University of Nebraska set up the first strength and conditioning program that ever existed. And so our profession and the way the DoD has kind of been doing physical fitness has sort of been riding together for the same amount of time. And what we've seen is exercise science growing exponentially, building up a body of literature. But the way that the DoD has been assessing physical fitness has kind of remained the same. And it's just very, very difficult to change. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys know what a slog it is to try and change things. So that drove a lot of what we were doing. And I think when we look at that episodic-based, appointment-based testing model that's been in existence, it probably served its purpose early on. But I think we know enough now to say that we can probably do things better. And it enables long periods of inactivity, and then enables and potentially encourages what we've been calling sort of unhealthy cramming behaviors as people try to get ready for their test. It's created a culture of training to the test. Somebody brought up, hey, I had a unit, an inter-service transfer. Hey, I had a unit, and we did the Army PT test, the old Army PT test, and 90% of the people in my unit scored a 280 or above out of 300 on the Army PT test. So don't you think that tells me something about their level of readiness? And I said, what that tells me is you got a bunch of people in your unit that are really good at taking the Army PT test.
Greetings, listeners. Today, Mops and Moses, we're going galactic. This was a fascinating episode. We're talking about Space Force. We're talking about human performance as it relates to Space Force. And I will be the first one to admit that having worked in the Air Force for a number of years as Space Force was getting kind of started, I didn't know a whole lot about the space of Space Force. But even more specifically, the human performance side of things. And so the person that we have on today provides a fascinating perspective about perhaps the final frontier of human performance. Alex, who do we have?
Today, we've got Carl Sheppard, also known as Shep. He is the senior human performance specialist for the United States Space Force. But he's had a pretty awesome career leading up to that. A lot of stuff I didn't even know, having known him for a little bit. He's been in the human performance field for as long as I have been alive, over 3 decades, including stints in orthopedic rehab, sports medicine, but a lot of it in strength and conditioning. Along the way, he's picked up a couple master's degrees, both in physician assistant studies and in exercise science. But he got his start enlisting in the Army in 1993 as a combat medic. And during his service, he got the opportunities to attend both the physical therapy specialist course and the advanced clinical competency course. And he was also a competitor for the Army powerlifting team. So all that kind of set him on the path of human performance stuff. And he really started doing it while he was still in uniform. He spent his last 7 years on active duty providing sports medicine and strength and conditioning service for all Army sports, Armed Forces sports, and the Army World Class Athlete Program. So that stuff took him to training camps and competitions at the highest levels in like at least a half a dozen sports all over the world. Really cool stuff. And then since leaving active duty as a civilian, he's done a pretty wide variety of stuff, directing a transitional therapy center, leading a fire rescue strength and conditioning program in Fairfax, directing an Army Wellness Center at Fort Carson. And he's also served in faculty positions for a few different universities where he taught exercise physiology, anatomy, biomechanics. So just a really kind of like wide, diverse career that led him to a really, really unique position at Space Force. Unfortunately, we don't get to have a huge conversation about how to train in zero gravity or what it's like going TDY to the moon or any of that kind of stuff, because it is a little bit different than that. But we do have a really cool conversation about an organization that is really kind of testing the limits of what military human performance can look like.
Yeah, and if you Google Space Force and specifically the performance side of Space Force, I think the hot topic at the moment is what they're looking to do with the PT test, and that's something that we dive into, kind of moving away from, sort of gym-based performance metrics and into the wearables space, and that's incredibly interesting. But honestly, even more so, we really spent some time talking with Shep about his perspective on the future of the career field of strength and conditioning as a whole, because as we move away from testing and numbers and more towards data and wellness, it changes, I think, what we start to look for when we think of the prototypical, human performance professional in this area. So ultimately, I think this podcast was one small step from Ops and Mo's, but it was definitely a giant leap for human performance. So enjoy. Well, I'll say this because I know just from what I've kind of my sense of just around particularly the strength and conditioning industry, because now we have a ton of contractors and obviously, the job market's all over the place. But the two things that I think people are most interested in is like, number one, and I'll probably repeat some of this as an actual question format, but just to give you a heads up, like number one, what is Space Force? Like what, because we've all seen, like, I came from an Air Force background. And when I was with pararescue a couple of years back, that was when Space Force was just kind of kicking off, just kind of launching, we'll say. And, they were appointing, who's going to be in command. And I remember that picture came out with whoever, I forget what her name was, but she was like swearing in. And I think there were Star Wars characters behind her. Like, no shit. And she may have got in trouble. I don't remember if she got in trouble for it or not, but point being, I think a lot of people just don't know what Space Force is. And so it'd be super interesting to get that perspective. But then the other piece that I know, especially in the human performance space, that keeps coming up over and over again is the whole idea of the fitness test approach and using wearables instead of testing. And I think a lot of that has to do with the controversy around the ACFT, and it's an entirely different look at what testing could be. So I know for myself, I've got questions about that, not from a critique standpoint, but more from like a curiosity standpoint, because I think it's fascinating.
Yeah. So, I can try to answer those as best I can. I'll probably be better at telling you what Space Force isn't.
That works too. Well, okay. How about let's start with that then. Softball question. What is Space Force not?
Space Force is not currently an operational organization of people that are actually personnel that are actually operating in low and high Earth orbit. That's a misconception a lot of people have. We don't know what the future holds, obviously, but essentially, Air Force is divided into major commands called MAJCOMs, as you know. Space Command was one of those, and the Air Force Space Mission was prosecuted by that command. My sense is, from my seat in the human performance world, is that the demand signal from space, in terms of it becoming combatant terrain, started to get louder and louder. One of the Delta commanders said, it used to be that Air Force Space Command was a command that provided a service to combatant commands throughout the Department of Defense, almost like a vendor, if you will. And it became clear that space was no longer providing a service to combatant commands, that space was actually becoming a combatant terrain, so to speak. I think that was part of what largely drove the idea that Space Force probably need to be its own proprietary branch of the Department of Defense.
So your people are not commuting to and from the moon is the answer right now.
There is no moon TDY of which I'm aware right now. So no one is, to the extent that I would know, nobody is actually operating extraterrestrially, as it were.
So from a human performance standpoint and specific to your role, is there does the conversation around training and physical preparation focus more on like just overall health, wellness, et cetera? Or is there like a subtle or even not so subtle drive towards like a future, like you mentioned, extraterrestrial battlefield that you're kind of training for, if that makes sense?
Yeah, again, I don't know what the future holds, and I wouldn't really take anything off the table in terms of possibilities. But right now, what we're dealing with is a command of personnel that are carrying out the space mission, to include the orbital warfare mission. And so those personnel have what I've called very low kinetic demand when they're at work, very low physical demand for the most part. What they have an overabundance of is an incredible, intense amount of cognitive demand. They are working 8 and 12-hour shifts, various sorts of consoles, carrying forth the mission of Space Force, which would be all missile defense and surveillance and satellite systems and all the things that you would associate with Space Force and what used to be Air Force Space Command. What they do is intense work. It's very important work. I've had the privilege of watching them do it, and I come away impressive and tired. I spend 30 minutes in there, and I feel tired when I leave. It's austere conditions, if you will, dark rooms, lots of equipment. Their cognitive vigilance and acuity has to be maintained the entire time they're on shift. And so I think General Raymond, when he took over as the Chief of Space Operations, he recognized quite astutely the opportunity that we had as a brand new service. That we didn't have an existing entrenched system of the way we needed to do fitness per se, and I think he wanted to take advantage of that. And one thing he said was that he wanted to take care of his people. And so I think that sort of servant leadership approach got buy-in from a lot of us and a lot of loyalty from us very early on. And so we've tried to craft what we're doing in terms of what our population is and what their demands are. And we have a couple of luxuries. One, we have a small force. I think we're still right around 8,000 uniformed personnel right now. And we have a very homogenous force. Again, from a physical standpoint, their demands are uniform, pardon the pun, across the force. So that gave us a lot of latitude in terms of what we wanted to try and develop.
I think it's cool to see an organization within the DoD that's so, like, the DoD is normally extremely driven by tradition and like the way things have always been, and the fact that you guys have a blank slate to draw up something entirely new and to take advantage of like all of the change and the evolution and the advances that have happened in like the human performance world over the last several decades. You're not tied to like a tradition of push-ups and jogging that had nothing to do with like construct validity for performance on anything. You have the opportunity to put together something that's tailored to the actual mission that you have and is like pretty much more legitimately kind of evidence-based. So I think that's really neat to see. I think there are some significant hurdles to get over by introducing something so new. And I'm curious your thoughts on like how the force is reacting so far to some of the ideas they're getting kicked around. Because as we've discussed previously, you guys have been in the news a lot. There's lots of articles wondering about what's going to happen, what this looks like, what the standards actually are, all that kind of stuff. So I'm wondering how that's going so far, honestly.
It's, trying to control the information flow, especially in light of the fact that we really are still in a developmental phase. Trying to put the pieces together in our program and do it with the considered counsel from all of the other people that need to weigh in on it. The judge advocate, the Surgeon General's office, the CTIO, cybersecurity people, they all have very valued, necessary inputs. And so trying to collect those things as we go and then apply and amend what we have down on paper to align with the advice and the counsel from those other bodies. It slows the process down, of course, but those are all necessary things that we have to have. And we can say we have a blank slate and we don't have a tradition that we have to uphold, but there are certain traditions and certain ways of doing things that still exist that we have to adhere to. And so trying to balance those things out is challenging. But so far, I will tell you that throughout the Air Force and I think the DoD in general, the support is there and there's enthusiasm there. And yes, there is skepticism there. When I talk to people in the force, when I go and do inter-service transfer briefs and new leader briefs at the squadron and Delta level, there's a lot of enthusiasm. There's a lot of great questions. We have some really, really robust discussions. And I think what happens is when people leave those rooms and go out into the internet and start to see information and that's coming out in bits and bytes, so to speak, that's where some of the mythology and misinterpretation ensues. And we understand that and we're sympathetic to that, but we also have to be careful about kind of getting out over the end of our skis, as they like to say, before we actually have a viable, approved product to put up on the shelf. And that's kind of what we're doing right now, is trying to find ways to to do things the way that we think they should be done for our population.
Well, we've seen that a lot, I can tell you. So first of all, I was surprised for anybody who's on Reddit, there is a Space Force subreddit that's a pretty hopping thing in terms of like, there's like very direct engagement between like junior personnel in Space Force and pretty senior leaders in Space Force on there, and like lots of dialogue about these kinds of things. And I tell you what, the personnel in your organization are very, very interested in how this plays out. There's a lot of conversations surrounding the wearables stuff and what the standards might be and how it'll work. There's lots of discussion happening in that forum, at least. But I'll tell you, as everybody who's watched the ACFT roll out over the last several years now knows, there's
still rolling.
Yeah, well, we're getting there. We're real close. But once you open the door to some of the like critical dialogue stuff, and especially once you express willingness to change policies based on public feedback, that's a Pandora's box. And once you open it, you cannot close it. And there's a lot of challenges there because no solution is ever going to be perfect. And the people who are like most negatively affected by anything are always going to be the loudest in terms of providing their feedback. And you quickly go down a rabbit hole of like, none of this stuff is going to be free from criticism.
No, great points. I think I might have just written those exact words in response to somebody today, that nothing is going to be perfect. We have to try and tailor what we're doing to the masses. And frankly, you do get a lot of debate from, outliers and outlier questions and people, reaching down in the bottom of the what if barrel. And some of those questions have been useful. Some of that debate has been useful. And, I can't think of every single thing. I'm not the smartest person in the room. And so some of these questions have made me step back and think about how we're proposing things. And we've been able to use that to our benefit and to the benefit of the Guardians. But you're right. There are some voices that are just going to be in opposition. And your point was well made. You can really go down the rabbit hole of getting into an almost endless debate over things that at the end of the day probably aren't going to really matter that much in terms of what the final product looks like, to be quite honest.
Well, so on that note, and I know like for the big thing, we talked about this kind of before pressing go, but like the thing that people hear most often when you type in sort of human performance in Space Force, at least right now on the big wide internet, is this whole concept, and I'll simplify it, but basically, like, instead of a test, a traditional PT test, it's going to focus a lot more on overall wellness, and a lot of that is going to be collected from wearables and sort of these passive metrics. And there's a community aspect to it, if I understand it correctly. And I guess to kind of start that line of questioning, I'm curious from where you sit, if the general consensus about that approach is largely, positive and forward thinking from like a command perspective, or if it's relatively conservative, because I line this up to my own experiences with the Army of like how much, and Alex touched on this with the ACFT, but like how much tradition and just sort of stubbornness we've been up against when it comes to changing the way that we test and measure readiness. And so to see an entirely new branch stand itself up and to take an entirely new approach is incredibly interesting. And I'm just curious, again, from your perspective, what the energy behind that looks like, to say basically, hey, instead of doing these arbitrary physical tasks, we're going to go from a data centric approach. It seems very futuristic, is probably a nerdy word to use there, but like it seems very futuristic on the surface.
No, I could understand that perspective for sure. I guess the best way to start answering that is, we have seen physical fitness assessed in basically the same way, I would say, for about 40 plus, probably getting close to 50 years now. 3 tests. A test for cardiorespiratory fitness with some time distance event, some flavor of body composition testing, and then some way to test what we'll call muscular fitness. And Alex and I have had this conversation before, and so I've been repeating myself over and over again for 2 years now, talking about this stuff. So what we've done, I think, historically, is identify things that are easy to test. And then through the years, they've become very, very important. And we'd like to say that how many sit-ups and push-ups you can do in 2 minutes lets me know your level of readiness. Why? Well, because they're easy to test, and we've been doing it for decades. What we're trying to do now is look at what's actually really important for our population, and then figure out the best way to assess that. So it's a little bit of a shift, and I say that not pejoratively to the way that things have been done, because I when that model, that sort of 3-event episodic appointment-based testing model was initiated, the field of strength and conditioning and exercise science was really sort of being birthed at around the same time, this late 70s, early 80s timeframe. Boyd Epley at University of Nebraska set up the first strength and conditioning program that ever existed. And so our profession and the way the DoD has kind of been doing physical fitness has sort of been riding together for the same amount of time. And what we've seen is exercise science growing exponentially, building up a body of literature. But the way that the DoD has been assessing physical fitness has kind of remained the same. And it's just very, very difficult to change. I mean, I'm preaching to the choir. You guys know what a slog it is to try and change things. So that drove a lot of what we were doing. And I think when we look at that episodic-based, appointment-based testing model that's been in existence, it probably served its purpose early on. But I think we know enough now to say that we can probably do things better, and it enables long periods of inactivity, and then enables and potentially encourages what we've been calling sort of unhealthy cramming behaviors as people try to get ready for their test. It's created a culture of training to the test. Somebody brought up, hey, I had a unit, an inter-service transfer. Hey, I had a unit, and we did the Army PT test, the old Army PT test, and 90% of the people in my unit scored a 280 or above out of 300 on the Army PT test. So don't you think that tells me something about their level of readiness? And I said, what that tells me is you got a bunch of people in your unit that are really good at taking the Army PT test. And so the point of that is that those tests, and you said it earlier, those arbitrary physical fitness tests, there's really no criterion validity between your ability to do push-ups or crunches or pull-ups or cross-knee extended leg crunches, or name your flavor. There's no criterion validity between that and how effective the light infantryman is going to be downrange. I can't tell you how many push-ups that person needs to be able to do to be combat effective. That whole process, as you guys know better than anyone, is extremely difficult to do. And so our population doesn't have a long list of physically demanding mission essential tasks that they have to be assessed on. So what we try to do is say, what's important about fitness to our population? And I think the important thing about fitness, maybe the primary thing, is that we want and need our people to be healthy. We want them to be healthy acutely. We want them to be healthy in the long term. We want them to be able to reduce their incident risk of musculoskeletal injuries. And quite frankly, when they leave Space Force, whether that's in 2 years or 4 years or 20 years, we want them to go out and have a good quality of life. I think there's an ethical component to what we do and a responsibility that we have. We've all the three of us on this call have all worn the uniform before. We ask a lot of our people. I think we owe it to them to take care of them. And we can still try to optimize human performance and do it in a way that promotes overall health and wellness and well-being. And so that's kind of what we've been trying to do.
It's interesting when you talk about how the sort of evolution of the PT test paradigm has evolved in tandem with strength and conditioning. That kind of makes me reflect on some of the things we've touched on in previous episodes with strength and conditioning, and specific to PT tests, and maybe even more specific to tactical strength and conditioning. I think a lot of coaches, whether they realize it or not, don't have, well, I don't want to say they don't have the ability, but they think within this lens of test, intervention, post-test. And when you take that away, I think it's going to be interesting to see how the conversation around strength and conditioning changes, because now all of a sudden you have sort of a constant feedback loop with your athlete, with your population, where you're able, if the infrastructure is set up correctly and the data is sound and the wearables are effective, you basically are engaged in a constant feedback loop of information on your athletes and your ability to change the intervention in real time, as opposed to, hey, we're going to do these metrics. I'm going to prescribe an intervention for this many weeks, and then we're going to test it. And if those tests have improved, then thumbs up for us. We've done our job, rinse and repeat. And I think what we're looking at from what you're describing to me is more of kind of what we harp on here, which is this emergent long-term athlete-centric model. And what Space Force is making the claim to is that we can back that up with all the data. So it's super interesting, and it's going to be super interesting to see. I guess the question I have there, from what you guys have already done and the staff that you already have with you, has the conversation shifted a little bit because you may not necessarily have the black and white that comes with an easy button PT test?
Yeah, that's an interesting way to look at it. The easy button is gone. We, in looking at strength and conditioning and tactical strength and conditioning, we wanted one of the questions was, if we are a truly all digital force, like that is written into the Guardian ideal. If we're going to be an all digital force, can we leverage technology in some way in terms of what we're going to do with human performance? And if we can, how can we do it? And that's driven a lot of what we've been working on for the last 2 years. We are mandated, as you well know, by the Department of Defense to report on readiness, and in terms of fitness, that involves cardiorespiratory fitness, body composition, and muscular fitness. So we have to provide some objective means to report on those metrics. Where I've said this, like, it's not that we had to wait for wearable technology to catch up. It's just that this opportunity has arisen, and by sheer happenstance, I think the technology in wearables has evolved to a point where there's enough criterion validity in the algorithms that run on some wearable devices that we can use those as a different way to estimate cardiorespiratory fitness than timed distance events, which is what we've been using for 40 some years now. I think there's a potential there to do that. And the other thing that could also enable potentially is sort of this ongoing uninterrupted manner methodology to look at someone's cardiorespiratory fitness. And in our population in particular, again, as you know, when we look in the tactical strength conditioning realm, we have tier 1 operators and tier 2 operators, and we kind of parse out tactical strength conditioning in those two realms. Well, our population is clearly tier 1 operational population. And for those people, I would argue that cardiorespiratory fitness is the king. It is inextricably related with acute and long-term health outcomes, positive health outcomes. It has an inextricable and hierarchical relationship with body composition. It has the same kind of relationship even with musculoskeletal injury. And so if we can look at that and appraise that in a way that's ongoing and uninterrupted, then I think that has driven our desire to try and make that happen. And the other thing that we could potentially do with wearables is enable and measure and quantify and qualify purposeful physical activity or exercise. And in strength and conditioning, all these components of human performance, they're all important, but the most important one is consistency. And I tell people all the time, I don't care who you are, I don't care what your training age is or who your coach is or what your goal is. If you're not consistent in your efforts, your effort will fall on its face. And so in saying we want to take away these long periods of inactivity that have been enabled by episodic appointment-based testing, we need to be able to quantify and qualify that. So we don't have the bandwidth to go out and watch Guardians every single day and annotate what they're doing in terms of exercise, but potentially wearable devices could give us a way to quantify and qualify that activity. And what I mean by that is organizations use step counts all the time. Devices count up your steps, do 6,000 steps, 10,000 steps. That's great, but that doesn't tell me anything about the quality of what you're doing. Did it provide adaptive stimulus? Did it cause positive physiologic change, or did it help maintain positive physiologic gains? We can use intensity minutes and met minutes and metrics like that to qualify and quantify what the Guardian is doing consistently. So that's sort of the digital aspect of what we're trying to look at. Body composition and muscular fitness, those things are not easily informed through the technology, if at all. And so there's still going to be some hands-on, face-to-face engagement, and I think that's fantastic. I will never in my career argue that we should try and minimize the component of delivering human performance.
So a question I have, having dealt with tech for a long time in the tactical space, and this gets, maybe it gets out of human performance, but maybe not. How do you keep, or is the infrastructure in place to allow for the policy to develop in tandem with the tech? Because from where I have sat, tech always moves faster than what the military is able to sort of work with. And what I mean by that is if you attach a wearable device to a test or to a metric, it may be a year down the road where a new wearable comes out, better clarity around the data, maybe research surfaces that shows that the metric that you're looking at isn't actually doing what you think it's doing, all these things that I think everybody's probably familiar with. So I guess the question I'm getting at is there a sense of risk going down this road where you say, hey, we're going to go with this product and it's going to give us this information and we're going to write policy around that, only to then find out in 3 to 5 years time that like, hey, maybe that actually wasn't correct. And we've now created this culture around a metric or a variable or a product that is extinct, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And some of that, I agree with everything that you just said, and we are experiencing all those sorts of growing pains. And you're right, the technology moves faster than policy changes. And so we are throttled in some ways by trying to figure out how the policies that are in existence are going to fit in with our ability to use technology. What will probably happen is some sort of a pilot year where we take some time to look and see, is this feasible out at scale? Are we able to collect the data that we need to collect in order to report back to the OSD on our level of readiness? Are we able to collect the data that's going to allow us to really take care of our people and tell them where they stand from a health and human performance point, and make sure that we direct the right resource to the right person at the right time, in all likelihood through some sort of embedded model. We see those throughout the DoD. The H2F is a great example of that. The successes and benefits of that are well known, and I think that's going to sort of help operationalize this to a large extent. I feel, and the people that were involved in development of this alongside me feel very confident that the reliability of the technology is there. When we look at the reliability of timed distance events, for instance, to measure cardiorespiratory fitness, those are indirect measurements. They're estimates themselves. And so the question comes up quite often, well, what's good enough? What's good enough for our population? What's a good enough estimate? And I think those are things that we're going to have to figure out. But the intent is there to try and make this work, and that's what we all do every day when we come to work, is try and figure out a way to yes, and figure out a way to get something off the ground so that we can make that assessment. In fact, is this a good, viable way to do this moving forward? And if we don't try it, we're just never going to know.
I think there's also a piece to just scale problems. We know it because like special operations community units have a lot of latitude to adjust things, and they're smaller and can make changes faster. And you guys are in a somewhat similar situation, given that like the entirety of the Space Force organization is roughly the same size as 2 Army brigades. So you can potentially adapt more quickly. And I know we've seen it already with some of the ACFT stuff. It seems to be that some people are hoping that as we go forward, we won't go into another 40-year stretch of having the exact same test for 40 years and no changes like we had with the APFT. And I think something similar will likely happen with you guys where hopefully, and this might be like terrifying to certain service members and things like that, but I think it's a good thing, is some degree of like iterative change every year or two, like slight adjustments to standards, slight adjustments to policies, where you are learning the lessons of the implementation you're going through and accounting for them. And especially in an environment where you're data driven, I think you're in a good situation to like incrementally adjust thresholds that affect whatever happens to a guardian based on their scores or their data or their results.
Yeah, and I think that's okay. I mean, it sounds like that's sort of what you're suggesting, and I would agree. I think it's okay to do that. We should learn and adjust as we go, and not be afraid to say that we figured out that maybe this needs to be tweaked and this needs to be changed, and we need to adjust this a little bit. Part of the initial development of this, or part of what drove it too, was I think the idea of taking away the ability to sort of weaponize fitness in the military. That does happen. And so how can we do things in a way that doesn't enable that? That's a very difficult thing to work through. There are certain requirements and expectations. We want to develop a warrior culture, just like all the other services have developed. How we do that through fitness is something we have to be really careful with, I think. We still want our people, we're still going to train our people, we're still going to do PT, we're going to resource it with a great staff of strength and conditioning coaches. We're working with the National Strength and Conditioning Association to be able to provide the tactical strength and conditioning curriculum to our unit fitness leaders so that we resource them and we can project power in terms of exercise science knowledge and methodologies out into the unit itself. And so some of the mythology is that because we're changing things, we're going to get away from fitness and get away from training, and we don't care about strength anymore, and it's cardio driven, and that's really not reflective of what we're doing. We want guardians to be able to develop strength in ways that suit their lifestyle and suit their op tempos and family demands, while at the same time monitoring things that provide us with reliable predictors of incident risk of long-term negative health outcomes and reliable predictors of incident risk of musculoskeletal injury. If we can keep our force healthy and keep them at work and keep them training, then we can maintain their quality of life, maintain the quality of the mission, and take care of our people in a way that I think we should, fiscally and ethically, by the way.
So what I'm hearing, and you mentioned this kind of earlier on, is the big cognitive burden that your folks have. And I'm curious if working with the NSCA and kind of looking towards the staffing requirements that you guys are going to have as you roll these programs out, do you think that you're after a slightly different archetype when we think of the traditional strength coach who may come from a strength power background, who may come from the standard strength coach? Not that there's anything wrong with that model, but now that you're after something a little bit more cognitive, I think of within H2F working with occupational therapists, and mine in particular, Sarah, she has a fitness background. She can talk the talk, but then she can introduce this kind of cognitive component to it. And to me, it seems like that's sort of the type of person that you might want on board with this project, not necessarily as opposed to this sort of traditional model, but I'd be curious, as you're kind of thinking about these teams, what this new Space Force strength coach, if you will, might look like.
Yeah, those are really astute comments. We may not necessarily need the person that was an assistant strength coach at the University of Alabama and knows how to run rooms full of high-level athletes. That person might be a great fit. But I think what we need in strength and conditioning coaches are strength and conditioning coaches that are very articulate and are able to explain the why behind the what and the method behind the madness, because our population, and this is not to say that the populations in the other services aren't like this as well, but I can tell you from experience that our population they are curious. They will ask questions and they want to know why, and they feel, and I would agree with them, that we have a responsibility to be able to explain why to them. Why are you asking me to do this? What's the rationale behind that? So we need strength and conditioning coaches that can do that and do it eloquently and do it in a way that it invokes a lot of confidence and validity in what they're saying, because our population they do their homework and they come in and they ask very astute questions. And the other thing I think that we need in our personnel is a lot of plasticity. We've got a guardian that I know that was a walk-on linebacker at a top-tier Division I school. We also have guardians that struggle from a biomechanical standpoint to do hip hinges and deadlifts and squats in a way that doesn't kind of make you cringe. And so our strength and conditioning coaches are going to need to be able to work with a wide variety of people in a wide variety of applications. Some of our units do unit PT, some don't have the time or the bandwidth to do it. And lastly, I would say we need good educators, really good educators, because the idea of using force multipliers for our strength and conditioning coaches is going to be critical, especially in the beginning. We don't really know exactly what we need in terms of staffing. So we may have one strength and conditioning coach, for instance, at Peterson Space Force Base, where there are 1,000 guardians. probably not the best athlete to coach ratio. So but until we can get that proof of concept up and go and resource that situation in a more ideal manner, using unit fitness training leaders is going to be critical. And so we've got to have good educators there that know how to deliver that NSCA course content. And then one last thing about your cognitive comment, we need to take a look at in the coming years what we're doing and how that parallels with the Guardian's cognitive optimization. I think that the closest population we can look at outside of the Department of Defense is probably the gaming community in terms of skill set, what they see visually, how they process what they're seeing visually, what they do with their hands with that information, how high their level of cognitive vigilance has to be. And so when we look out into the gaming community, they already get it. They have human performance teams that work with them already. And I just heard a story the other day that the gaming community now worldwide is the most lucrative, financially lucrative sport, if you will, in existence now. And so if you follow the money, you'll find people that understand how the right way to do things. And I think what we'll see is that as human performance and health metrics change, you'll see a direct relationship with cognitive performance. And so what are the units using to measure Guardian combat effectiveness at the console, if you will? And being able to marry up those measures of performance and measures of effectiveness with what we're doing on the health and human performance side of the house. And certainly this physio-cognitive connection is going to be a part of that. We don't know exactly how we're going to do that yet, but I'm pretty confident we'll be taking a close look at that.
I'm fascinated by the connection with like esports gaming kind of stuff, but I'm going to jump back to a previous part of your answer about like coaches as educators. Cause I think at the core, and this applies to Space Force, but it applies across tactical strength and conditioning, is all like, no matter where you work, no matter what the setting is, at some point, tactical professionals are going to need to train without you there. Right. And that's not something that's necessarily like built into the model of collegiate or pro strength and conditioning. And I've seen this live with friends who were like Division I collegiate athletes, like high performance athletes who, and like, I was not at that level, certainly athletically. And fast forward a few years after college, they're coming to me for advice on how to train. And I was confused at first because like, hey man, why? Like you were doing so much more than I was. And he was like, yeah, I was just doing what I was told though. Nobody ever really explained the why. And I think there's a huge component of like in the tactical setting, we need to create autonomous athletes. We need to create autonomous tactical professionals who can take lessons from the training sessions that are provided for them or for the classes that are provided for them and be able to execute training on their own or for their small team without a human performance professional there that makes more sense and still gets after the real goals and doesn't elevate risk unnecessarily. I think that that's a core conversation that is not always communicated very effectively, certainly during kind of the hiring processes and things like that.
Yeah, the super great points that you just made. Our embedded team, the Guardian Resilience team, at the helm of that team is going to be a person called the Holistic Health Integrator. I've been calling him the quarterback of the embed team, and they're going to have a huge responsibility, and particularly like in hiring the strength and conditioning coach and in understanding what the demands and the expectations are and helping that strength and conditioning coach with resourcing and making sure they have what they need to prosecute our mission out into the unit, and education. I love to use the word autonomous operator, if you will. I think we want to create that. The strength conditioning coach should serve as a resource, a subject matter expert that's able to provide counsel and education and resourcing to the unit fitness leaders, and then educate the Guardians as well. To your point, a lot of the Guardians aren't going to have time to work out at work. The units just don't have the bandwidth to do unit PT. They're going to have to find ways to get it done on their own. And using our embedded subject matter experts and the unit training leaders as resources, I think will provide a good platform for Guardians to kind of figure out what the way to fitness looks like for them. Doesn't have to be running. They don't have to be weightlifters. They don't have to be powerlifters. They can sort of pick their poison. What we're worried about is, are they healthy? And have we done everything we can to mitigate their risk of injury?
It kind of back to Alex's question, and we've been talking about strength coaches as educators, and that's a friction point, I think, from what I've seen, especially within H2F and the Army, and really anybody in kind of a conventional setting where the coach athlete ratio skews to the hundreds and the thousands. Like, you hear a lot of grumbling from the coaching community about feeling that they're not making an impact, feeling that they're just there to like teach, they're not there to coach. And it's, to me, that's curious, because it's like, you know, the impact that you have as a coach from educating those people and from becoming a force multiplier is almost as well. I would say in some cases it's even more significant than just putting reps and sets down on a piece of paper and then, you know, turning the music up and running a weight session like you would see in any Division I collegiate space. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's just, it's interesting as you see more coaches take these positions in the tactical field, they're having to confront a different angle of what being a coach really means. And to now hear, Shep, your perspective on what the Space Force is looking to do, it almost takes it a step further. And so I guess what I'm interested in, if you could speak to it, or if it's purely notional, that's completely fine. But you said that you've got, obviously being in a similar location to the NSCA, you've got a great relationship with those guys. Like, is there at that level of kind of the industry conversations being had around what it really means to be a strength and conditioning coach? Or am I just like on a completely existential soapbox with this?
I don't think so. I get on those myself quite often. I think it's a valid question. To be honest, I hope that our profession is looking to evolve in that way. And I understand the joy, if you will, of getting in the gym, getting around the chalk dust, getting your hands on people in a coaching way, and getting it done at the ground level. Like, that's the reason why a lot of people got into it to begin with. But in this age of information and in this age of do less with more, I think that idea of force multiplication and educating and serving as a resource is going to become more and more pivotal to the success of our profession in general. And there are always going to be those instances working with those isolated sort of captive athletic audiences where, yep, you're going to need the coach that knows how to write broad scale programming for large groups and knows how to run a room. And that's going to be a pivotal, I think that will always be a pivotal part of the strength and conditioning profession. But I hope that the idea of strength coaches being educators right alongside that actual hands-on coaching paradigm, I hope that becomes entrenched and institutionalized in what we're doing. I can't tell you that up at the NSCA headquarters, even though it's right down the road, that they're having those explicit conversations, but I think maybe the writing might be on the wall a little bit. It sounds like maybe you might be thinking that same sort of thing, but based on your comments just now.
Yeah, no, and flipping it around to sort of the athlete side, and with your population specifically, have you encountered any friction in terms of sort of compliance, buy-in, whatever you want to call it? Because from my own experiences, first with special operations, buy-in was never really an issue because it was pretty easy one-to-one to say training in the gym is going to have a carryover to engaging in combat, because in that space, there is a lot of combat. In the conventional military, it's a little bit less so because you're dealing with non-combatant MOSs, folks that may not necessarily deploy. So there's a little bit more of, I suppose, a challenge creating buy-in in some cases. I'm curious, we already talked at the beginning, nobody's TDYing to the moon yet. So for lack of having maybe an explicit physically demanding mission set, do you have any issue creating buy-in? And if so, kind of how do you navigate around that?
Yeah, I think part of whatever buy-in problem exists was something I mentioned earlier, that there's a sense that when we start talking about exploring wearable technology and appraising cardiorespiratory fitness and appraising this idea of consistent activity throughout the year, that I actually heard people say it's like, it seems like we don't really care about PT anymore. And I think and I try to convey that, no, it's quite the opposite, that we are still going to train and we are going to resource it and we're going to have people doing their thing. But as long as I can, until someone comes along and tells me to stop, I'm going to continue to advocate that we not just pick arbitrary things because we can test them and say that they're important. I don't know how many push-ups a guardian needs to be able to do to be combat effective at the radar console when they go to work. I don't know how many crunches they need to be able to do. I cannot answer that question, and I'm not sure that we'll ever be able to answer that question. And I would say that that same argument exists in the other services. It's a very, very hard question to answer. But what I can tell you is that we can look at muscular fitness in terms of a guardian's ability to move correctly. Do they have the strength that's required and the motor control that's required to move safely in space and resist deformative forces and all those kind of things? And if I can establish parameters based on the evidence of reducing musculoskeletal injury, and if I can establish parameters based on our ability to take cardiorespiratory fitness and predict positive long-term health outcomes, then I think I can explain that in a way that is going to evoke buy-in. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but that buy-in piece is difficult to do. And we may be told that we just have to come up with some other way to test muscular fitness, for instance. I hope that we don't end up sort of being put down a path where we have to pick some arbitrary muscular strength and endurance tests that don't really tell us anything about what we want to know in terms of performance and mission capability. But that's a battle I'm willing to fight, but I may end up losing that in the end. We'll see.
No, I mean, you nailed it. And it's interesting because we've talked about this before. I think we even talked about this on the episode that we did where we sort of laid out what we think the ideal test should look like. And the angle that it sounds like you're taking is one that we were supportive of, which is that you go after building a robust human, the assumption then being that on top of that, the mission essential tasks, whatever the job demands are, should be relatively easy, as opposed to going after the test, the assumption there being that passing whatever the test is means you will be an effective human. And I think it's an interesting shift in perspective that, in my opinion, is probably the right way.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, that's the way things have been done for a long time. Is tell me, is the unit ready? Well, how do you do that? Well, did they all pass the push-ups and sit-ups and run? Well, yeah, they did, but that I can't validate that's telling that I'm able to tell you that your unit is ready because they did that. That just tells me that they just passed the test.
I'll tell a brief story that I think is indicative of like the problem at the root here. And this goes back a few years, teaching a course. A lieutenant showed up to the course, a National Guard guy, I can't remember what state, but he had been sent because he was the fittest person in his unit, quote unquote, fittest person in his unit. And that was, of course, assessed based on push-ups, sit-ups, and 2-mile run time, because that's what we did. And like day one of the course, I think this is the afternoon of day one, might be the morning of day two. We're introducing like foundational movement patterns for the first time. So he's learning how to do a deadlift. And he set up a barbell with a couple 10-pound plates on it, and he throws out his back right away. And the guy's like 21, 22, throws out his back lifting 65 pounds. And we had to ask, we're like, man, like, is this just like a freak accident? Like, this is crazy. This like unbelievable that would happen. That doesn't make a lot of sense. He's like, no. Like this kind of happens to me every now and then. I'll be good within like 2 or 3 days. I'm kind of used to it. And that rattled me, obviously, right? Because he's a maneuver officer in the Army who is so susceptible to injury that like lifting a weight that is less than half of his own body weight is like routinely injurious to him, to the point that he can perform limited duty for like multiple days after that activity. He's clearly not the fittest person in his unit. He's just good at these really arbitrary metrics that aren't assessing anything super relevant to the actual tasks he's expected to perform. And clearly the tasks you're expecting guardians to perform are very different, but I would kind of hope that most humans would be able to pick up something off the ground without getting injured, especially if they're like an otherwise healthy 22-year-old. We get really caught up in like creating metrics and putting them on a pedestal.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great story. It's kind of a tragic story, but I think it illustrates the point really well. And I like what you said about trying to appraise fitness and human performance in a way that builds a competent human being, specifically from the fitness standpoint, since that's what we're talking about. And then if we can establish that through cardiorespiratory fitness and movement competency and a reasonable beneficial level of body composition, then you can layer on stuff on top of that. Once that person can move correctly and protect their chassis, if you will, and once we know that they're fit enough where they're probably going to be healthy and also protect themselves from injury, then you can get as romantic as you want with strength and conditioning programming and do all those other things that you layer on top of that. But your point was really well made. If you start layering things onto people that have dysfunction and are doing things in a suboptimal way, then you're going to get dysfunctional, suboptimal results. So we want to do our homework and our housework and make sure that our people are healthy and are safe to move, because we're asking them to move. And again, I think that invokes that ethical and physical responsibility that we have to our personnel. The CDC estimated 4 years ago that the DoD spent around $3.7 billion a year on musculoskeletal injuries alone, and about $1.8 billion that year on obesity-related preventable diseases across the Department of Defense. And what I always say is, I don't have a chart that tells me that if you spend this much money on preventable disease, you're doing it right, or if you're spending this much money on injury, you're doing it right. But those figures can't be the best way to do things. I think we can do things better. And that's what we're hoping to come up with on the other side of this, is just a better way to do things, evolve with the science.
I think, and this is a rabbit hole we don't really have time to dive down because we're bumping up against the hour mark pretty soon here. But I think there's also, just to like do our due diligence and like make sure we're accounting for everything here. Like Drew and I both come from like very much like a strength and conditioning focused background, like a physical domain focused background, and so do you, Shep. But I think even like this entire conversation hinged around like the physical aspect of fitness and health and wellness. And I think part of that problem is the same as the reason we got trapped with some of the dated physical fitness assessments, is that the physical domain is kind of the easiest to quantify and the hardest to ignore. It makes itself known. And I do think there's a large conversation, and we dove in a little bit to like how fitness can affect cognitive performance, but there's many other domains of wellness. And if we're talking like the DoD level, you're talking about like social and financial and spiritual and nutritional and all the other things that I think suffer from the same problem of being, or like the opposite problem, I guess, of being hard to quantify. That we don't really have any like easy to proctor tests for any of those things necessarily. And hopefully this also leads us into a conversation about how to like identify the need for interventions and things that are not as readily quantified. And like I said, I don't want to open up that whole can of worms, because none of us are experts in those things necessarily, but it's a great point you've made repeatedly in this conversation, that just because something is easy to measure doesn't mean it's important. We still have to deal with important things, even if we don't have a ready-made test for it.
You're spot on, and you're right that those things aren't within my sphere of my knowledge, skills, and abilities. But from a headquarters Space Force perspective, the intention is there to carry this forward using reading all the tenets that are there in the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff instruction on total force fitness, and understanding that their health and human performance metrics may not look ideal or optimal, and it may not be an issue for the strength and conditioning coach. And we need people on our embedded team that are able to recognize that person's home life may be in shambles, or their finances are in disarray. Their work home life balance might be all out of whack. And so that's the whole idea behind a holistic approach to health and human performance. And you're right on point, Alex. It's not just all about the fitness. That's just, everyone loves talking about that, and it's easy to talk about, but we are absolutely focused on the other components of total force fitness, if you will, and we intend to address those and try to resource those.
Shep, as we kind of close out, I've got two questions for you. And I'll try to keep the puns to a minimum, but as the Space Force looks towards new horizons, what challenges, and it human performance specific doesn't necessarily have to be, but what challenges do you foresee as you guys kind of roll out this concept of Space Force human performance?
I think we'll be, I don't know if it's a challenge, but I think it's a task for us to try and marry up what we're doing in this holistic health and performance effort with what the Guardian is doing in terms of mission success and mission lethality, if you will. I think that's going to be a challenge moving forward, and then trying to figure out what right looks like in the training room versus what does right end up doing in the operational room, sort of linking those things up. And I constantly go back to that as being a challenge for us moving forward. And then, you know, what's the faith validity of what we're doing out in the public? And that's a concern, and it's easy to say, this is the Department of Defense and we're the military, and we don't care. We know what we need to do inside our own house, but you know, the public has their eyes on what the different services are doing, and trying to make sure that we communicate what we're doing in a way that's illustrative to the public of what the big picture is. We run the risk of giving the wrong message out if we don't do that correctly, and that's going to be a big aim for us moving forward, is communicating what we're doing and marketing it in a way that's effective. I think we've largely failed at that across the Department of Defense for a long time, educating and marketing not just to the public but to our own people what we're doing and why. So one of our aims is the education piece and making sure that we are marketing, communicating effectively the why behind the what.
And then we've touched on, I think, some of these sort of throughout the episode, but what are some of the opportunities that you see along those same lines?
Well, I think there's an opportunity to show that what we hope is going to be a big paradigm shift in the way we're doing certain things from a fitness standpoint. I think there's an opportunity there to show the rest of the Department of Defense that everyone can kind of get on board with doing this at some level. Now, our system isn't going to be the system that's going to answer all the questions for all of the operators around the DoD, because the physical demands are disparate, widely varied. But at least at a baseline level, and I'll keep poaching the term you guys are using about building a complete human being, and starting out with that. I think to get that aim accomplished across the DoD, there's an opportunity there for Space Force to stand something up that can show a new way to do that. And then you can layer on all the other door kicking, close quarters combat, operational stuff that you need to on top of that. But at the baseline level, I think there's an opportunity for us to show that this is an effective way to do things.
That's awesome. Well, Shep, thank you for your time. I know a lot of folks, like we mentioned early on, have sort of different ideas about Space Force, don't know much about it, don't know much about the human performance piece. And I think for me, at least, this has been incredibly enlightening.
Yeah, I appreciate the time too. And I know that it's probably challenging on your end. We are in a notional developmental stage. And so there are limitations as to what we can speak about objectively and conclusively right now. And I appreciate your patience and the respect that you've given me and the questions and discussions. And it's It's been a real pleasure, and I hope to circle back around and do this again. Thank you.
Well, we'll bring you back. We'll bring you back next time once you got a policy in place, and we can talk about what you're really rolling out. And then a little bit down the road from there, we can bring you back to talk about how you're training people in zero gravity.
Yeah. That moon TDY is sounding pretty good right now. So hopefully that'll be a thing in the future.
All right. Thanks, Shep. Appreciate you.